Hello, my name's Gillian Pugh and I'm one of the co-editors of the 6th edition of Contemporary Issues in the Early Years.
And I'm Bernadette Duffy and I'm Gillian's co-editor.
We're very pleased to be able to talk to you a bit about the book and how this edition came about. But going back to 1992, the first time that I was involved in pulling these first chapters together, these were the days of the last Tory government when government ministers didn't believe that education of young children was important and didn't think there was any evidence to show that it was effective. And so those of us working in the sector at this time were arguing very hard with government to create more services. If we look back over those years, the increase in the amount of provision, both free provision for 3- and 4-year-olds and the daycare for younger children, has dramatically increased. We've lived through a Labour government which put a huge amount of resource into early years, as well as setting up a more coordinated approach. And now under a coalition government, although money is very tight at the moment, there are still considerable increases, particularly now for 2-year-olds, but we will come back to that shortly. My initial objective with the book was to try to invite a range of people who were expert in their field to talk about all of the issues as I saw them then that were important for people working in the field with young children. And to try to create that triangle between research, policy and practice. What do we know from research is important in children's development and for children's learning and for the policies affecting the services for children, and how does that impact on policy and practice? Bernadette joined the team 3 issues ago, was it? And how did you, what was your perspective of those early issues?
I first came across contemporary issues when I was a student studying for my master's, and it was, I think, the very first book that pulled all the issues for early years together in one place and presented early years as a whole rather than in different pieces. So certainly as a student I found it incredibly useful. So it was great many years later to have the opportunity to contribute to it as well.
Great. This edition, this 6th edition, each edition has a new chapter or 2 new chapters, and every time the chapters are completely revised, because this is an area of fast moving change in terms of policy. We're delighted this time to include a chapter on child protection, as well as our revised chapters from last time on children's centres and on children's health. But we'll talk more about these as we go through looking at different issues. Some of the things that have struck me as I've looked through this 6th edition that have become even more important, I think predominantly, well, 2 things really. One has been the absolute importance of understanding how young children develop and how they learn, and the craziness of creating policies that don't take that into account. And this has to be the bedrock, not only of the curriculum that we offer children in nurseries, but our work around children's health, around child protection, around children with special needs. But the other thing is the extent to which our knowledge is growing all the time, that informs that, particularly issues around brain development and early attachment. And I think these are things that we probably didn't take sufficient account of in the earlier editions. I suppose the other thing that is more of a challenge now than it was even in our 5th edition was the funding constraints. Here we have growing numbers of children under 5 with a growing birth rate, growing numbers of services and growing demand for services, but at a time of huge cutback in public expenditure. one of the issues that we ask at the end of one of the chapters was that if we know that services for young children have to be of the highest quality, if they are to be of value, what do we need to achieve this high quality? Let's ask Bernadette to have a go at that one first.
I think that's very much the theme of the book, Julian.
Yes.
It's about the importance of really high quality provision for young children and high quality services. I think time and again what research points us to is it's the people in children's lives that are important. Their parents, the practitioners across health, education, social work who are working with them that make the real difference, and making sure that those individuals have the expertise and the knowledge that they need in order to do that job is absolutely fundamental.
Yeah, I mean, we have a chapter in the book on training and qualifications, but this issue is fundamental to every chapter, isn't it? That if you don't have the right skills, the right understanding, and you don't know how to work effectively with young children and with their parents, then, as the longitudinal EPI study showed, you're not going to get the outcomes that you want, and particularly for the most vulnerable children that perhaps need the greatest amount of support.
I think one of the strengths in the book is how each author in each chapter really draws on research and their own considerable experience to identify what's working well currently, but also, crucially, what needs to be developed for the future. And particularly the chapter with Sandra, Fiona and Kathy Silver's work, looking at what does make for high quality provision in the early years, points out quite rightly that it's a complex number of things that need to be put together with great sensitivity and skill in order to get the best outcomes for children.
And that research as well was in a way reinstated the early National Child Development work for Plowden, that the home learning environment, as they call it in the EPI research, is absolutely critical. So you need well-trained staff in your nurseries and in your play groups of different kinds and with your childminders, but you also need to nurture that relationship between parents and children at home.
Yeah.
One of the themes of the last government, or the main theme of the Labour government, was Every Child Matters, and this in a way came to embody everything that government felt about integrating services for children, focused on children and families, the famous onion diagram with the child and the family in the middle and the practitioners coming together and the policy coming together. So I suppose one of the questions that those of us that were very much part of creating that Every Child Matters agenda ask ourselves is, well, has Every Child Matter survived under this new coalition government? What's your view about that one?
Does every child still matter?
Does every child still matter? Indeed.
I think it's been interesting with the coalition government's take on it, because as with Every Child Matters and the 5 outcomes, there is a strong emphasis on the outcomes for children. I think there's been a change in emphasis, however, in that with the 5 outcomes, it was very much for all children. There is a stronger emphasis on targeting resources at those children deemed to be most disadvantaged in the current policy and practice. And while we certainly want to make sure children who have already experienced disadvantage have every opportunity, the danger is if we don't do that in a sensitive way, we can risk stigmatising the very families we're trying to help. And it tends not to be a successful strategy to tell people, congratulations, you're doing so badly, we're going to give you a service, rather than them coming into a universal service that everybody else comes to, and then very sensitively and in a very sophisticated manner offering them the additional things that will help them make a difference for their child. You get very different outcomes, and I think Anne's chapter on children's centres in the book very much explains that approach of how within a universal service which is open to everyone and seen as something that a good parent does, going to a local children's centre, how within that universal service you can very effectively target resources to go to the most disadvantaged, so that every child does still matter. I think Iram's chapter on diversity as well points out that if we don't continue to put that at the forefront of our mind, we're doing a great disservice to children and to wider society.
And this was the thinking behind the initial Sure Start initiative, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Which we were both very closely involved with. Moving away from, if you like, the old days when you only got a daycare place if you were at risk of harming your child, to a situation where okay, if you need to prioritise, then prioritise in the areas of the greatest need, but have an open access service within which specialist provision could be made.
Yeah.
The other area that I think is a challenge at the moment is the role of local authorities. I mean, Linda's chapter specifically deals with the changing role of local authorities. This is a government that has less time, I think, for the role of local government than has been the case in the past. And local government under the Every Child Matters agenda had a very strong role in being responsible for bringing services together across education, health and social care, of supporting, and of course in the early years sector we've always had a large private and voluntary sector amount of provision, haven't we?
Yeah.
But I think local authorities are struggling as their funding is cut, aren't they, to provide the level of support that's needed. I mean, in schools on the whole, nearly all teachers are well trained and with good heads and so on. You perhaps don't need the support in a sector like that, where the early years sector, where you have smaller units and less well-trained staff, perhaps a greater need for a local authority role, and local authorities struggling to provide that.
I think it's very much the case that schools have been with us for much longer than early years and been funded to a much higher level than most early years services. So schools have had an opportunity to develop structures and systems and ways of working, supported by places like the National College, that enable them to take much more control of their own development and draw on research to do that. Early years, for a long time, was the poor sister in the education system. And it's still relatively recently, the 1990s aren't that long ago, that there has been this big investment in early years. Now, early years has made tremendous use of that investment, but there hasn't really been the time to develop the workforce, to develop the ways of working that schools, etc. have had, to enable the early years sector to be as strong as other sectors. And so local authorities have played a crucial role in supporting the early years to develop those skills. And it may well be too premature to do away with that role and to rely on sector-led improvement when the sector hasn't had enough time to really mature.
Yeah, because Linda's chapter points out that the local authority role is much more now about commissioning.
Yeah.
But as you say, if there isn't the expertise within the sector to support the improvement and development, you can only learn from Nellie if Nellie knows what they're doing, can't you really, to coin a phrase?
Unlike the school sector, if you look at the profile, yes, we have some very big providers in early years, but we also have the small community-run nurseries, which are 2 people with 24 children in a shared resource such as a community hall, who just don't have access to the same training opportunities and support opportunities that a school would have. So without the local authority going in, they're at a very big disadvantage.
And I mean, even small primary schools are struggling in that respect, aren't they, and having to link up with other primary schools.
Yeah, federations, yeah.
One of the knotty issues, I mean, we've both already spoken about the key issue of how well trained the staff are, and we've been struggling on the qualifications issue for years and years, trying to argue that working with young children is as demanding, if not more demanding, than working with sixth formers, and that we should therefore expect our teachers and our other early years professionals to be as well trained as those working with older children, because this is such an important stage of a child's life. Partly because of cost, I fear. We haven't got as far as we would like, have we? And the current response that government has made to Cathy Nutt-Brown's research on report on qualifications has reinforced the importance of qualifications, but hasn't really resolved the issue of early years professionals versus, or in tandem with, early years teachers and qualified teacher status, has it?
And Cathy, who is, of course, is one of our authors in our book, did a very, very thorough review of qualifications in this country. And her recommendations were very well received across all parts of the sector, which is a credit to her and the hard work she and her team put into it. And I think Cathy was very clear, firstly, about the importance of having the best qualified people working with our youngest children, and also we've been very clear about what we needed them to be undertaking in their training in order for that to happen. So very clear about the importance of child development, how children learn, the importance of people, before they even come into the sector, having GCSEs, grade C for English and maths, making sure that they're the right sort of people. I think there has been some disappointment in the sector, as you say, that the response to that in More Great Childcare, which came out in January, has not been as Cathy and her advisory group envisaged. And we, in some ways, have even more confusion. We have the new early years teachers being introduced from this September, but they don't have QTS. So we now have early years teachers with QTS who are on one set of terms and conditions and have one lot of job opportunities and career prospects. And we have early years teachers but without QTS who will have terms and conditions determined by whoever employs them in whichever way they wish. So not really the same status in reality as one would hope. There's also been some concerns about the content for the new early years educators and for the new early years teachers, about whether their training there is going to put enough emphasis on areas such as play. Given that the early years teachers are going to be supporting children from birth, that importance of really understanding how children learn from those very early days and the importance of play and the value of play and attachment, whether there is really enough emphasis on in the new qualification. It's great that the Coalition want to see higher standards in early years and early years practitioners, but there's still a very large question mark about whether the current current policy is actually going to achieve what they hope.
Takes me back to the late 1980s and the Rumbold report, which was the very first government report on early years, and we had endless arguments about the importance of play, and it was, you kind of feel you take 2 steps forward and you're in danger of going even more than 2 steps back. One of the other issues that More Great Childcare raised and caused a lot of rumpus, and I think there's been a little bit of backtracking, was the whole issue of ratios. Complex, because ratios, the size of groups on their own, unrelated to how well trained the staff are and so on, you can't really separate off. But there has been a bit of a rethink, hasn't there, around what is an appropriate number of children for any one adult to be responsible for. As you say, small babies, adults only have 2 arms, don't they? But what's your current thinking about where we're going on ratios?
I think the response to More Great Childcare's ratios was a very good example of the sector working together.
There was unanimity, wasn't there, about this being a bad idea, these suggestions of larger groups.
Yeah, particularly for the youngest children. There was a lot of concern about increasing ratios, particularly for under ones. I think however well qualified the member of staff and however wonderful the enabling environment they've created, it's hard to see how increasing the number of children from the current 3 upwards was going to make for a better deal for children. I think some ways though, we are still to have a proper professional debate on ratios based on evidence and actually looking at the evidence. And Cathy and her colleagues look at some of that in their chapter.
Yes.
That there is a sensitive interplay between the number of adults, but also between the qualifications of those adults, and also how we deploy them. There's also issues about different parts of the day. A little one coming in at 8 o'clock in the morning, whose parents perhaps have had to race them through, may need one-to-one even when they're 5. However, when they're a 2-year-old playing happily in the garden with a group of other 2-year-olds who know each other well in a wonderful environment, may well be happy playing together in a group of 6.
Yeah.
So we need to be much more sophisticated about what it is we're wanting children to get from their nursery experience throughout the day, and how we use adults to then support that, rather than simply saying it's this number of adults to this number of children.
That's a really important point, and there's evidence too, isn't there, of the unhelpfulness of having your best qualified member of staff sitting in an office somewhere. It's all very well having a really well qualified teacher running a nursery, but if they're not actually there with the children and leading by example and showing other staff what to do, then that's not going to be terribly helpful, is it?
I mean, we know from research, the EPI research that both Iram and Kathy are two of our authors were involved in, that it's that actual interaction between the adults and child that make the difference.
Yeah.
And it's needing to have our best qualified people actually interacting with the children on day-by-day basis. That has an impact on the children themselves, but also on the colleagues they're working with.
Yeah.
And that's the model in the EPI research that had the best outcomes. Traditionally in early years, there has been a tendency as people get qualified for them to move out of working directly with children into more office-based work.
Not just early years, unfortunately.
And we also know from some of the research, which Pauline quotes in her chapter, from the earliest professional, that the earliest professionals that were introduced specifically to work with the youngest children were fine, in most cases, were working with the 3 to 5 year olds rather than with the babies and toddlers. So we not only need to think about in terms of, do they get distracted from management issues, but also do we still have a tendency to think the older the child, the higher the status of the people working with them, and not really understanding that those first 2 years are absolutely fundamental.
Yeah. No, a lot of many things for discussion with your colleagues there. We talked earlier about improvement and supporting improvement in early years settings. The new Ofsted regime, this has been a very confused area, hasn't it, with different types of early years provision being inspected in different ways. Where are we at on that? Brenda and Jan's chapter covers that very well, doesn't it?
Brenda and Jan's chapter is excellent. Speaking as the head of a children's centre which is subject to 3 different Ofsted sorts of inspections.
Well, one after the other.
Slightly different, and all looking at slightly different things in different ways. I think moves to try to integrate them and have a view about what young children need, whichever setting they find themselves in, is really important. I think the new Ofsted framework is good, that it's more rigorous. I think it's good that it's got a stronger emphasis on looking at what's actually happening for the children and how the adults are interacting with them. Sometimes with the other Ofsted frameworks previously, there was a tendency to look more at how many bits of paper you'd got rather than what was actually happening with the children. So good to see that emphasis. I think one of the concerns that's identified in the chapter in our book, though, is the expertise of the Ofsted inspectors coming in. Because however good the framework, it depends on the inspector you've got coming in on that day. And while there are many Ofsted early years inspectors who are excellent, who experienced and qualified, there is still a case that you can become an Ofsted early years inspector after a very minimal amount of experience and training. And if you have somebody coming in and misinterpreting what, as you were saying earlier, Gillian, about how young children learn, can inadvertently, in the desire to improve things for them, give settings the wrong message about what actually is important for young children. So, for example, there are concerns sometimes about how literacy is being encouraged when it becomes too formal too early.
Yeah, and this I mean, again, too formal too early. I mean, the whole of my working life, I mean, going back years now, the whole issue of what is appropriate for 4-year-olds in reception classes. I mean, this, because we had so little provision 20, 30 years ago, we thought, well, 4-year-olds won't have to be in reception classes much longer, and the formality that they often experience there will become a thing of the past. But this actually hasn't happened, has it? Because there seems to be always a downward pressure. Let's get them starting reading earlier. Let's get them doing fractions earlier. And yet all the evidence shows that too formal too soon, it can, except in exceptional circumstances, be counterproductive.
I think all the authors in the book would have the highest expectations for young children, and we want all young children to do it as well as they absolutely can. But I think we need to have realistic expectations. And just because young children can do something at a young age doesn't necessarily mean it's the best thing for them either in the short term or the long term. So we can drill children and we can narrow down literacy to a very tight phonics-based approach. But while that will show short-term gains, it won't show the love of reading and the understanding of literature and the ability to use books to gain information and to understand ideas, which is what we're actually wanting young children to develop as readers. So I think we need to be very mindful that while our objective is quite rightly to make sure that children are literate, that they're numerate, that they have all the skills they need for school, that if we do that in the wrong way, we actually undermine the very thing we're trying to promote. And we end up with children who really don't understand what it is they're being required to do, and sadly become disenchanted with the education system.
Yes, and this is how we turn children off too soon if we're not careful, isn't it? That brings us on neatly to thinking a bit about the early years foundation stage, which of course has been revised since our last edition came out with reduced goals. And in the news at the moment, a suggestion that we would revert to tests for 5-year-olds, which has had something of a mixed reception. And mindful through the excellent chapter of Philippa and Julie and Liz around children with special needs and how we make sure we respond to those needs and treat all children as individuals. What is your thinking around the whole issue of assessment and the new goals and I mean, Kathy Nutbrand and Karen's excellent chapter on defining the different purposes of assessment. Are we in danger, do you think, in early years at the moment with this drive towards checking on attainment all the time, of mixing up the different purposes of assessment?
I think Kathy's chapter makes it very clear that we can inadvertently use assessment inappropriately. And we can use it very successfully to promote children's learning. I think the goals being reduced, some of my colleagues would say it was more on paper, and then when you actually look at the new goals, there's just an awful lot in them, rather than them actually being that much less. I think we've got a change with the goals in that previously the goals at the end of foundation stage were described as aspirational. So while it was something we aimed for young children, there wasn't the expectation that every child would achieve all the goals. The new framework does work on the expectation that children will achieve those goals by the end of the year in which they become 5. Now that is a big shift in terms of what we're expecting for some children who will only be just 5, indeed some won't even be 5 when they actually are assessed under the profile. We've also increased the expectations within the goals. So, for example, the literacy elements are actually closer to level 1 expectations than they are to the previous goals. Now,
are we setting children up to fail, do you think?
I think the risk is that we are. We are danger of expecting an awful lot for little ones before they even start statutory schooling. One could question quite what the rest of schooling is going to do if we sorted it all out in the early years. But the danger is that while some children will achieve these things, for other children they may be very new to the education system, there may be other issues going on, and they may need a bit longer to get there. And if we label them as failing so early, when they're only just 4, we're in danger of giving their parents messages that they failed, which is not the starting point we want to have. And
is the idea that these results will be published or made public, if not put in the local paper?
My understanding is that the idea of the baseline when children start reception is for the school itself. So I don't think there's an expectation that it will be published. But I think as soon as it becomes something that Ofsted looks at, soon as governing bodies are looking at it, parents will quite rightly want to know where their child is and what's going on. And if we're assessing children so early in their reception year, in that formal way, good teachers will always be assessing the children.
Well, I mean, this is the whole centrepiece of Kathy and Karen's chapter, isn't it? That assessment is the basis of planning for individual children, knowing how individual children are doing and ensuring that we're creating an environment in which we're scaffolding their learning and so on. So very important. I mean, I can think of nothing worse than children feeling or parents thinking that their children are failing at 4.
It's a hard conversation with the reception teacher. Your first meeting with the parent is to say, actually, your child isn't reaching the expected levels. That's not what you want in your first encounter.
So somehow we have to hang on to having the highest aspirations for all children, but not making children feel that they've already failed the high jump that young in life.
Yeah. The legs just aren't long enough.
They're long enough. Very nice. Now, we've been asked to say a little bit about who we think some of the key figures are in the early years at the moment. And I sort of hesitate to say this, but it does seem to me that all the key figures in the early years are contributing to this book, or a great many of them are. I think we're immensely fortunate to have such an incredibly distinguished group of authors. If you think of, I mean, if we take, for example, two new authors this time, Harriet Ward and Becca from Loughborough, who have written a chapter on child protection, and Harriet is probably the foremost researcher in terms of child protection and has published an overview of all the child protection research for the government, as well as doing some fascinating work looking at infants coming into care and under what circumstances it succeeds if they go home. And Philippa Stobbs from the Council for Disabled Children, who has been instrumental in helping the Department for Education rethink its strategy around children with special needs and children with disabilities, has written our new special needs chapter. But they're by no means, there are two of our new authors, but you have been working, have you not, Bernadette, with government around a whole lot of issues. You were advising on the Tickell review of the early years foundation stage, weren't you? And a lot of work around Cathy Nutbound's study of training. And then we have others as well that you might like to say something about. Cathy?
Well, I mean, Cathy Silver and Suraj Blatchford have had a major impact on policy in this country, but also across the world.
Well, with their EPI study,
it's
been astronomically influential, hasn't it?
And I still think we still have a lot to learn and to benefit from really implementing what they found out in the research. I think we're very lucky in this book, Gillian. We have you, who's having been looking at this field over the years, to have that historic idea of where we've come from and where we're going, and some of the many benefits we've had over the years, but also some of the risks about not really understanding what's important in the early years. So I think there are people like Anne and her chapter on children's centres, who has been very instrumental in moving children's centres to looking at things like the core purpose. So a big shift from a core offer to really being clear about what is the purpose of children's centres. So I think we're incredibly fortunate in the authors.
And we mustn't forget health. I mean, Jacqueline Barnes is a very eminent researcher, evaluated Sure Start, and is particularly strong on health issues. Kate Billingham, I think, was number 2 in the Department of Health, responsible for the Healthy Child Programme.
Very involved in the 2-year-olds.
And all the work around 2-year-olds and the health visiting programmes. So, again, on the health side, we couldn't have got 2 people who are more engaged and influential in both pushing forward the health agenda, but ensuring that we all realise that health is everybody's business. It's not just something that happens when you go to the doctor, but that actually it has to be central to all of our provisions. So we do feel very, very grateful to have got such an excellent group of authors here. There's also the issue of international development, isn't there? That, I mean, for a long time, people years ago used to come to England because of the good old nursery schools, and then England began to close its nursery schools, so everybody went to Australia or Sweden or New Zealand. But I think one of the things that comes through from the chapter that Satya and Cathy have written about international snapshots is how important it is, if you like, not to compare apples with pears. They don't probably put it as clumsily as that, but how important it is to see that all provision is a reflection of the societal aims and the culture of individual countries. And there are interesting parallels in terms of care and education still being separate in so many countries, and you know, the different value that is placed on the care for the younger children, the education of the older children, although we would like to see it integrated, but very much reflecting a society's aims. I was fascinated by their comparison. One of the books I really enjoyed years ago was the Tobin and Davidson and Wu study of kindergartens in 3 cultures, Japan, China and America. And Tobin's brought out a more recent study, and 25 years ago, whenever it was, the Japanese and the Chinese children, their culture, the group was very strong. and slight regimentation and obedience to the group, whereas the American culture was about individual realisation and creativity. And Tobin's more recent study has reflected a shifting in both directions, apparently, that the Americans have become rather more regimented and getting ready for school, rather perhaps as we have, whereas the group cultures of China and Japan have loosened up and are emphasising creativity a bit more. Now, whether one can generalise from their study, I don't know, but important, isn't it, that we don't say, well, they do it better in Finland or Scotland or Australia or whatever, that we all have to see our early years provision as part of the kind of culture we are. Yeah. Do you have any other sort of thoughts on that one?
I think that chapter is very, very good about seeing early years provision as part of a whole society, rather than something that can be just picked up and dropped on. One of the examples would be Reggio Emilia in Italy, the wonderful things going there. It doesn't work the same when you just pick it up and drop it off in Camden in London, where I am. There is a whole other set of expectations and families and the ways of doing things. I think the one about creativity is interesting. There is some great work about collaborative creativity, which is about how the group works together,
the group can be creative
together. So you bring together the American and the European idea of the individual as creativity, but you also bring the really important things from other cultures, such as China, about the importance of working for the benefit of the group as a whole. So not seeing your creativity as just for yourself.
Well, that's very interesting,
so
isn't it?
There is some wonderful stuff, and it's very good. I mean, my experience of going to places like China has been that it gives, I think, probably more insight into your own provision than it does into the Chinese provision, because you're seeing afresh what you do, having looked at what somebody else does. So incredibly important, and Sasha and Kathy's chapter is an excellent one to not only think about what's going on elsewhere, but also helping to reflect on what we're doing here.
Yeah, and whilst, our listeners and observers won't all be able to go abroad and look at provision, if ever you do get a chance to go, not necessarily abroad, but just to other parts of the country, other parts of the UK, it really does help you reassess your own provision, even if it's a nursery up the road or in the next local authority, to see how people do things differently. It's a very useful way, isn't it, of reflecting on your own practice.
Yes. Yeah, and thinking about, why do we do things? Because we can take things for granted.
Yeah.
But it's important always to keep assessing and thinking, is this what children need from us?
Yeah, exactly. And there is no right way. I remember having endless discussions with people years ago about what is good quality, what is quality, and are there any absolutes? And there are some absolutes.
There's a few things that are important.
But it is very culturally determined, isn't it? What have you found helpful, Bernadette, in terms of websites?
I think probably back from '92, there's a lot more access to websites than when you started, Gillian.
Absolutely.
So I think there is some brilliant. I think the ease with which one can get hold of things from the Department for Education's website and get hold of ministerial speeches.
And from the Scottish, the Northern Irish and Welsh government websites as well. It's all very accessible.
We're very lucky now that it is so easy to get hold of things. The For Children website has a lot of good information and a lot of access to archive materials, which from things like the National Strategy, which did some very, very good work in the early years, which is still relevant and still important for practitioners. For more current thinking and debates, I often pop onto the Nursery World website because very short, very focused articles that help keep up to date with what's going on in the early years. So I think there are lots of really good websites now.
And every chapter has a number of websites related to that chapter, don't they? And Sage has also picked up articles from their own journal publications. So these are all of these are linked together.
I think it's much more helpful for the busy student now that you can get hold of things so much more easily. And
we were asked as well to structure our chapters a little differently this time, weren't we, to make sure that we had some good practical examples. So a lot of the chapters have got vignettes and case studies, haven't they? But also summaries of the key points, some questions to answer as individuals and some questions to be used as part of group discussion, and we hope that all of these will help those using the book to think through the issues for themselves, because clearly the chapters have been written from a particular perspective and will hopefully raise some issues, but the important thing is people think through things from their own perspective, isn't it? And
Yeah.
relate to their own practice. So the chapters nearly all have case studies and vignettes of practice. For example, there are 3 chapters we haven't particularly mentioned yet, all of that are useful in this respect. Penny and Perpetua's chapter on listening to young children, such an important part of how we work. So until quite recently, people were still saying, well, you can't listen to young children, they've got nothing particular to say. But a really strong chapter that, with some very good practical examples, and drawing on the training pack that Penny produced on listening to young children. The chapter on working with parents that Mary Crowley and Helen Wheeler have done, again draws on very practical examples through the Peel project and the REAL project, Parents and Early Learning, and the REAL work with Cathy in Sheffield, with some first-hand centre-based examples of effective ways of practitioners working well with parents. And Carol Aubrey's chapter on multi-agency working draws very heavily on 2 quite lengthy case studies of both the challenges and the successes of multi-agency working, of bringing people together across different professional backgrounds to work, I think, in short-start settings and local authority multi-agency settings. So I think some really helpful examples there, which, and again in other chapters as well, which we hope students will find sort of keep their feet on the ground while giving them plenty to think about. So I think that probably wraps up the sorts of issues we thought we would share with you, and we hope very much that you find the book useful and that this short discussion has added a few more things for you to think about as you develop your work as an early years practitioner.